Okay, so what happens in 1835? Uh, there's no one wants to pay taxes, right? I mean, you still have this to this very day, and also in the Anglo-American community, which was centered in East Texas, there's a lot of unhappiness, especially after the law of April 6th, 1830 is passed. And once again, I know that's a mouthful, the law of April 6th, 1830. I wish they named it something catchier, like the screw you American law. Wouldn't that be much better and you could remember it much more easily? But that's how you should remember the law of April 6th, 1830. It really is a screw you American law. It stops immigration, or tries to stop immigration of Americans into Mexican Texas. So there's anger about that. There's anger that the Mexicans, after years of kind of leaving Texas alone, have decided that they want to get a piece of the action in Texas, especially as the cotton production increases in Texas. So there's just a lot of unhappiness. In 1835, what you have is William Barry Travis. Um, he leads another group of kind of hotheads, and he captures Anahuac. And he forces Anahuac, he forces the small garrison. Now, this is the summer of 1835. He forces the small garrison, the small Mexican garrison, Anahuac. He captures it and he kind of kicks them out of Anahuac. Most Anglo-Americans opposed what Travis did. They thought he was going too far, too fast. They didn't want a war with Mexico. This was a scary thing. War is a scary, pardon me, war is a scary thing. And so Travis is much more extreme than most Anglo-Americans about kind of pushing Mexico. And when he captures Anahuac the second time, and then he's successful and he kicks the Mexican garrison out, um, this is going to cause a sequence of events, and it really is what causes the timing of the Mexican Revolution. So again, to repeat, in the summer of 35, William Barrett Travis and a group of his kind of what you might call radical Anglo-Texans capture the Mexican customs port, or fort rather, at Anahuac. They take the Mexican soldiers prisoners. They don't kill anybody, and they kick them out. They kick them out to Mexico. And during this, so that's one thing to think about. Now, during this same time, what you have is Texans, Anglo-Texans, are starting to meet in kind of assemblies. And their model really for this is the American Revolution, the various continental congresses that met before the American Revolution in the 1770s. And what these are called are consultations. It's kind of another kind of boring word, but the root of it is consult. They're consulting with each other. And what we're starting to see in Mexican Texas by the summer of 1835 is the beginnings of a revolutionary government that is thinking much harder about leaving Mexico and creating Texas as an independent nation outside of Mexico. So again, this is called the consultation, a kind of a boring name, but not that hard to remember what it means because consult, folks are consulting with each other. Um, During this kind of period of upheaval, Stephen F. Austin shows up back in Texas. Remember, he'd been thrown in jail, and importantly, he'd been thrown in jail not because he advocated for Texas to be independent from Mexico, but because he'd written a letter advocating that Texas break from Coahuila y Tejas and that Texas become an independent Mexican state. And this letter was captured by Santa Anna spies, and it was enough to get Austin sent to jail. Um, so he's sent to jail, and then he arrives back into Mexico City. I'm sorry, he arrives back into Mexican Texas in the summer of 1835. By that point, Austin is radicalized. He believes now that there's no way that Texas can work within the Mexican system, that it needs to break with Mexico, that Santa Anna is a dictator. you can't work with a dictator. The Santa Anna has consolidated all the power in Mexico City. Santa Anna is no friend to Anglo-Americans in Mexican Texas. And so when Austin comes back to Mexican Texas in 1835, the summer of 1835, he's become radicalized. And he becomes a voice saying that Texas needs to leave Mexico. Really, for the first, you know, what, 13, 14 years of Santa Anna's experience in Mexican Texas, he had tried hard to make Texas work as a state in Mexico, of course, as a slave state in Mexico. But by 1835, he'd given up on that, and he's become radicalized, and he starts to think, no, Texas has to leave Mexico. Santa Anna is a dictator, and we can't live under a dictatorship. You know, if the law of April's, I'm sorry, uh, if the Federalist Constitution of 1824, if Santa had never been voided, if Santa Anna had never become dictator of Mexico, it's very unclear if Texas would have left Mexico. Uh, there would have been a Texas Revolution. I think what would have happened is, even if everything had gone well in Mexican Texas and slavery was allowed in Mexican Texas, as I said in class, it's hard for me to see how the United States would have not have grabbed Texas at some point because the land was so valuable, and sadly for Mexico, Mexico was so weak. I think the Texas would have been part of the United States at some point, but there might not have ever been a Texas Republic. We'll never know, right? We can sit, and it's what historians call counterfactuals. We can speculate all day on what could have happened, but I know it's, for a lot of y'all, it's hard enough to figure out exactly what did happen. So let me get back to that. Okay, so as I talked about, I'm going back to Anahuac now. As I had talked about earlier, in 1835, and again, we're just about a year from or less from the Alamo, William Baird Travis and some other kind of what were called hotheads capture the customs fort that the Mexicans had established in Anahuac, which was located where the Trinity River runs into the Galveston Bay. And they'd kicked the Mexican soldiers out. They hadn't killed anybody, but they'd kicked them out. Well, Santa Anna explodes in anger when he hears this news that the Anglo-Texans had captured this fort, this Mexican fort. Remember, this is all Mexico at this point, right? And Santa Anna is both the head of Mexico and he's head of the Mexican army. So Santa Anna decides something has to be done in reaction to William Baird Travis's action in capturing Anahuac. Also, Santa Anna has come to believe that the Anglo-Americans in East Texas are a danger, that they have to be suppressed, that if they're not suppressed violently, then they will break from Mexico. And remember the wider context that Santa Anna is dealing in. He had come up with Arredondo in 1813 to crush another attempt, another revolution in Texas. That revolution in 1813 was part of the Mexican Revolution against Spain. But by 1835, Santa Anna now is a Mexican national hero. He's become the dictator of Mexico, although very controversial. And when he looks at Anahuac and when he looks at how the Anglo-Americans are acting in East Texas, it triggers in him the same kind of worries about the fear that Texas being so close to the United States, that Mexico's hold on Texas is very fragile, right? Which turns out to be true, actually. So Santa Anna feels like, and I'm not being apologetic for Santa Anna, not only was he kind of a war criminal, but sadly for Mexico, he was a completely inept general. But from Santa Anna's way of thinking, Mexico City's always super sensitive about its northeast. It's always super sensitive about Texas because Texas has traditionally been a border province, first with Louisiana, then the United States. And so Santa Anna, he reacts to Anahuac But by deciding that he has to send an army into Mexican Texas to suppress what he thinks is an impending revolution. And so that's what Santa Anna does. In December, or in the summer of 1835, Santa Anna decides I've got to send an army into Mexican Texas.